carbohydrates, which are definitely very much misunderstood macro category. And there's a lot of polarized opinions about carbohydrates. So we're going to cover a bit of those in the live, and hopefully you enjoy and are available to ask some questions at the end. So I'm going to share my presentation. Just to start, to give a background on what carbohydrates are. So all green plants produce carbohydrates, starch and sugar in their leaves through the action of photosynthesis. And sugar itself comes in many forms. Sucrose, common table sugar, is a disaccharide which breaks down during the digestive process into simple sugars such as glucose and fructose. Glucose is the primary sugar in the blood, and fructose is the primary sugar in fruit. So other common disaccharides are maltose, malt sugar, and lactose. So anything that ends in O's is, you can know, is basically a sugar or a carbohydrate. So a lot of people are curious about the difference between sugar, ordinary table sugar and white sugar, and the sugar in fruit. And a lot of people, especially in the keto community, will actually avoid sugar even in fruit. And the main difference between these two sugars is that sugar in fruit contains fiber, and it also contains a lot of vitamins and minerals and cofactors for absorption. The sugar, just table sugar, is basically stripped of all nutrients. It's nutrient devoid. And what you'll often hear is that white table sugar is nutrient depleting. And the reason for that is because when sugar is metabolized, it requires other vitamins and minerals to be present in order to metabolize that. So if those vitamins and minerals are not present, and enzymes in the food itself that also contain sugar, your body will leach those from itself in order to complete the process of metabolism. And in that sense, having white processed sugar is actually nutrient depleting. So that's what that means when people talk about sugar depleting minerals. So, as an example, when B vitamins are absent, the breakdown of carbohydrates cannot take place. So, when we refine grains, so in this example, in the next slide, which is a kernel of wheat, when we remove the bran layer, which is basically what happens in the refining process of refining grains, we remove the vitamins and minerals and phytonutrients. So what that means is, in order to metabolize the carbohydrate, our body will leach the B vitamins from somewhere else in the body in order to metabolize those carbohydrates. And it's almost as if you can think of it as your body not really recognizing what this food is because it's not really in its complete form. So your body is kind of surprised to be receiving something that isn't complete, and it will leach what it needs from other places in order to complete the process of being metabolized. So this is something really important to differentiate between whole foods, carbohydrates, and fruits, and then just ordinary white sugar. And a lot of people kind of, especially in the keto sphere, they don't really make this delineation because it's just about counting carbs and counting carbohydrates. And if something has, let's say, 5 grams of carbs, people think, oh, it's okay, it's fine, even if it's 5 grams containing white sugar. And it's important to note that that white sugar and the sugar in fruits are just not created equally, maybe in terms of the amount of carbs, but not in terms of the effect that those have on your body. So what is fortification and enrichment of carbohydrates? So it's basically the addition of vitamins and minerals to restore nutrient levels or the addition of nutrients that weren't actually present in the original food. And the reason why fortification and enrichment is an issue and doesn't really make sense is because often these nutrients are added in really high amounts that you can't really control if you're eating multiple fortified or enriched foods. And an excess of vitamin A can reduce bone density in adults and increase the risk of birth defects and also cause liver damage. So each kind of vitamin E, folic acid, which is often added also to foods, all of these additions can actually, cause health issues because we're absorbing them in quantities that aren't really present in the food because they're added synthetically. So another issue with fortification is that um, basically, so to use the example of milk, vitamin D, skim milk is often fortified with vitamin A and D. So skim milk is the milk that where the fat has been removed, and therefore vitamin A, D, and K are actually removed when the fat is removed. So what will happen is that the milk is refortified with the vitamin A and D. However, our bodies aren't actually able to absorb those vitamins because they need fat in order to be absorbed. And this is why vitamin A, D, and K are called the fat soluble vitamins because they require fat to be absorbed. So there's no point in removing fat from a food and then adding those vitamins if they can't even be absorbed. So this is often what happens in the process of fortification, and it basically just becomes something quite redundant. Another thing is that the supplements that they add in the case of food fortification are often synthetic versions of the nutrients rather than whole foods versions. So they just are less bioavailable, um, and they also contain less antioxidants and less phytonutrients. So this is a kind of a side note. So basically, in our long COVID supplement protocol, we speak a lot about how to combine nutrients. So, as one example, zinc and copper are two minerals that should always be combined together. And when we don't combine them, what will happen for example, is if we just take zinc, copper will be depleted from elsewhere in the body in order to metabolize and use the zinc. So that's why in our long COVID protocol, we always recommend to take oysters or an oyster-based supplement, in which case zinc and copper are present together. Or we need to take, if you're taking a zinc isolate, you need to also take a copper supplement, or we give these other food alternatives. So 10 grams of beef liver, goose liver, lamb liver, spirulina, shiitake mushrooms. All of these things can be a substitute for taking a copper supplement. But there are quite a few, combination vitamins. So vitamin D and vitamin K2 are another one that where they have to be taken together. And this is another reason also why we always mention to get the nutrients that we need from whole foods rather than from vitamins and supplements. So another thing to mention in terms of carbohydrates is soaking and sprouting. I think I've spoken about this quite a few times, but in order to neutralize phytic acid and also get rid of the enzyme and deactivate the enzyme inhibitors, it's really important to soak grains and carbohydrates. And you can find out, and soaking them with an acidic medium. So, for example, with kombucha or with um, uh, um, lemon, buttermilk, kefir, whey, any of these other acidic mediums. And the times for soaking you can find online because each grain kind of requires a different soaking time. But this is really important in order to kind of optimize the bioavailability of grains. So, okay, so a lot of people, when they think of carbohydrates, they just think of, you know, energy. So that is one of the main roles of carbohydrates. They give us energy, and glucose is the primary source of fuel for the body and for the brain. But another really important and less well-known function of carbohydrate is actually related to um, communicate cellular communication. So I'm going to read something from a book that I really like that speaks about adaptogenic mushrooms and cellular communication. So many carbohydrates function in the body not as fuel, but as communication devices. Sugars that are found on the surface of our cells enable our cells to recognize and interact with each other. And sugars on the surface of red blood cells help to determine blood type. Um, the oligsaccharide branch of the carbohydrate family plays a critical role in immune function, and many carbohydrate structures turn out to be tumor and anti-tumor associated. So the communication function of carbohydrates has led to some fascinating discoveries about food. So mushrooms, which have been part of Chinese and Japanese diets throughout history, have shown to contain carbohydrates that improve communication between immune cells and make immunotherapy for conditions like cancer more effective. So these are, in the case of mushrooms like reishi, here in the picture, shiitake and maitake. So basically, when we think of these adaptogenic mushrooms and their immune properties, the reason why they are good for the immune system is because they improve the communication between immune cells, um, which is something that a lot of people don't associate with carbohydrates. Um, so here is a book, a traditional Chinese medicine book from, I think, 3 to 7,000 years ago, the 29th century BC, and it contains information about these kind of adaptogenic mushrooms that were used. And here are a list of just a few different adaptogenic mushrooms and their functions. So cordyceps is mostly known for endurance and performance. Reishi is for stress and insomnia. It's a good mushroom to take before bedtime. Lion's mane is mainly related to stimulating brain cell growth. It's a really good mushroom for cognitive function. Shiitake has cholesterol lowering compounds. Agaricus has the highest concentration of beta glucans, so it's great for the immune system. Maitake is a metabolic balancing mushroom, and chaga is an antioxidant, and it's also great for the immune system. But the good thing about adaptogenic mushrooms, although they have these specific functions, they will also adapt, hence the name adaptogen, to your body's specific needs. So they kind of modulate their function in that way, which is quite interesting. So another function of carbohydrates is in the form of prebiotics. So I'm sure many people have heard of probiotics, the healthy gut bacteria that lives in our digestive tract. And prebiotics are basically carbohydrate fibers. So some people call them resistant starch, some people call it prebiotics. Um, they basically feed the gut bacteria. They travel through the small intestine and they feed the gut bacteria in the large intestine. And the reason why this is important is because the gut bacteria actually produce butyrate in the large intestine. And butyrate is a short chain fatty acid that's really important in the immune modulating capacity. So, we want to make sure we're feeding our gut bacteria well so that they're producing butyrate and they're helping the immune system be supported, basically. Um, yeah, and prebiotic fibers are also quite popular in the context of the keto diet because we don't actually digest them. They just move through the digestive tract and feed the bacteria. So examples of flours that are prebiotic flours that are quite well used in the keto diet are cognac flour, green banana flour, squash flour, apple flour, chestnut flour, and sunflower seed flour. So basically, for example, in the case of green banana, before the bananas are ripe and before the sugars are really concentrated and saturated in the fruit, if you just make the flour with the green bananas, then that creates a low glycemic and very prebiotic type of flour. So here is, I've got a recipe of how to make tacos actually with green banana flour, and they're really delicious. Actually, after finding this recipe, I made them myself, and they were really great. So it's really easy just to combine, just three ingredients: salt, water, and banana flour, and you can make a really great low glycemic, gluten-free, and also gut bacteria feeding taco. So, glycemic index versus glycemic load. So, what do we mean when we talk about glycemic index? So, basically, glycemic index is how a measure to determine how drastically your blood sugar rises when you're consuming a certain food. Foods are ranked on a scale from 0 to 100. So pure glucose is 100, and the lower food's glycemic index, the slower the blood sugar rises after eating the food. So, of course, more processed food is more higher glycemic. So glycemic load basically takes into account the serving size of the food as well as the glycemic index. And this is really important. So you'll see in the context here. So this, I think it's a Snickers bar or something like that, has a lower glycemic index than a watermelon, but the glycemic load is much higher because the amount of sugar we get in a really small serving in processed food is definitely much higher than in the case of a fruit. So I'm going to stop there. If anyone would like to see the full presentation, it's on the Phoenix Learn platform. The Thursdays are just a kind of half presentation or taster of the full presentations, but you can always see them there. So I'm going to answer a couple of questions. Is it possible for a human to survive on a diet that excludes carbohydrates? So this is something that I think is quite controversial because ancestrally speaking, there have been quite a few hunter-gatherer tribes that survive solely on animal products and dairy and high-fat and high-protein diets. I think, and actually this is shown later on in the presentation, there have been some kind of long-term studies done on diets such as the paleo diet, and they have actually showed that it's detrimental to the gut microbiome. So for the reasons that I spoke about earlier in the presentation, the issue with these diets in the context of these clinical studies that were done was that the people were eating really low carb vegetables, and they weren't getting enough fiber, basically. And then the fiber wasn't feeding their microbiome in the proper way. And that meant that they had a higher proportion of bad bacteria and a lower proportion of good bacteria. And this is associated with some types of cancer and heart disease. So basically, the lack of fiber created some kind of unfavorable gut bacteria issue. So this is kind of one reason why, doing something like a keto diet or a really low carb paleo diet is not really recommended in the long term. I'd say this is one of the main reasons why. And although throughout history, it has been observed that some groups of people were super low carb. I think that, it really depends on your epigenetics. And actually, that was a question that someone else had in terms of the DNA test. Um, so yeah, your epigenetics do have a lot to do with it, because some groups of people have evolved to consume certain things, certain types of food, and they've evolved. So lactose, as the person asked in the question, lactose is one of them. And you can do a DNA test, yes, to test about lactose intolerance. I think that it's not really. It's probably better just to do a test, just to test yourself in terms of consuming dairy, consuming milk or not, to see. But basically, the lactase gene, which is basically a mutation, a gene mutation. Sometimes it's present in both parents, and sometimes it's present in only one parent, and then that will strengthen or weaken your capacity to digest lactose. And then basically, what on top of that, what will also affect your capacity is whether or not your gut health is good. So whether or not things like antibiotics or pesticides or unfiltered tap water or super processed food. So all of these things could also inhibit your ability to digest lactose, even if you do have the mutated gene. But yes, if you did a DNA test, you would be able to know if you have kind of the mutant gene or not to digest lactose. Why do some do great on low carbs, but other have no energy and gain weight? Um, yeah, this can also relate to epigenetics. So that is one thing to take into account. It can also relate to where you are, like the age that you are, and if you're a woman or a man, and if you're a woman in your childbearing years as opposed to in menopause. Because generally, women in the childbearing years need more carbohydrates, because we require more body fat in order for our hormones to function. And this is why going on a really low carb diet and being really low body fat stops the menstrual cycle, because basically you're just not having enough carbohydrates in order to have the calories and have the body fat to maintain your hormones properly. Um, so yeah, so there is some difference in the age, in the gender, in the age category that you are. All of these things, and your epigenetics, all of these things will affect whether or not you do well on carbohydrates. And one way of kind of determining is also using something like a blood glucose monitor, because I've done experiments before with friends where we've woken up and tested our blood glucose, and then eaten, let's say, a date in the morning, and then tested the blood glucose. And my blood glucose doesn't rise really so much, but a friend of mine will rise extremely high just after one date. Um, so different people's bodies also have a different reaction. And you can kind of see what your reaction is by using a device like Levels, or a continuous blood sugar monitor, or even just the blood sugar monitors where you prick your finger and then test that way in the morning. Can be interesting to see. Is a high carb, low fat diet better or worse than a low carb, high fat? So um, So low carb, high fat is more like a keto diet. Um, and that definitely has its functions. So in the case of diabetes, metabolic syndrome, like hypoglycemia, issues with blood sugar dysregulation, low carb, high fat is a good idea, because fats are satiating. And basically, if you have metabolic syndrome, diabetes, any of these things, it would be assumed that you have an issue with insulin. So basically, if you want to make insulin more sensitive and work better, you need to stop asking it to be overused. And in order to do that, you just stop consuming sugar and carbohydrates in high quantities, because then it gives the insulin a chance to recover. So keto and low carb, high fat is good for that in the short term. High carb, low fat, I don't really know if there's really any reason why someone would do that. Um, Someone diabetic wouldn't do this, because the issue that with diabetes is with carbohydrates. So you wouldn't have high carb. And basically, low fat diets are generally just not recommended because, well, I did a whole presentation on fats, but basically, fats are really, really integral to health, because every single one of our cell membranes is made of a lipid bilayer. And fats are the basis of all of our steroid hormones. So estrogen, progesterone, testosterone, all the sex hormones. Fat is really implicated in brain health. So low fat diets just don't make sense at all because of how important fat is in terms of just, basic physiological needs. And, if anything, carbohydrates are the one thing that we can at least reduce a little bit, because they are present in vegetables. We have carbohydrates in carrots, in all kinds of all vegetables have carbohydrates, beans. Even if we're not eating bread and pasta and the kind of processed food, we're still consuming carbohydrates. And in general, people consume too many carbohydrates and not enough protein, because that's just something that's normalized in our culture with all the processed food. So yeah, I can't really see any context in which a high carb, low fat diet would make sense. Okay, I think that's it for the questions. Yeah. Thank you very much for listening. And as always, if you have any subjects that you would like to hear about, feel free to post in the Facebook group. And yeah, and if anyone is interested in the Phoenix protocol, the group coaching program that we do for long COVID recovery, you can find out more information about that by scanning this QR code. We will start a new cohort in October. Right now, we're running 2 cohorts, but a new one will start in October. So thank you very much for listening, and see you next week.